Okay, welcome Adam back, and I wish you a Merry Christmas time.
Oh, and you and the audience.
For those who don't know the story, I think many maybe research you or your background, but you're a cryptographer, besides other things, CEO of Blockstream. What is the beauty about cryptography?
I think it's a very interesting building block for the digital world. So if you think about the physical world, you have the laws of physics about, how hard it is to break into something, how the balance between defense, like building a castle, and offense, to break through the walls of the castle. And with the advent of public key cryptography in the 70s, late 70s, it became possible for the individual ultimately to have an impenetrable fortress to secure their communications, and with more kind of combining those building blocks to achieve privacy in a digital space in a similar way that we can have in a face-to-face conversation, but at a distance. Because otherwise, I think people have made the argument that in the digital age, we have less privacy than our parents or grandparents did in previous generations, because so much of the online world is recorded, and it turns out from Snowden's revelations, surveilled and so forth. So there are rules and laws protecting your privacy, but they are not very well respected even by the establishment that is tasked with ensuring that they're respected. And so the best way to make use of your rights is to exercise them directly, so that if somebody wants to go beyond that, they have to take more expensive measures per individual, like if somebody is committing a crime, to go and surveil them, or figure something out, rather than the default, which Snowden showed, is basically record everything, decrypt it all, and save it for later, so you can build big indexes and dossiers about everybody, which is a bad thing for society.
Maybe also in regards to government surveillance. In some countries, it's important to have private communication.
Yeah, I think it's part of sort of societal norm and respect for individuals' self-sovereignty, that it's part of a quality of life that people would expect to have a right to privacy and a right to organize and associate and communicate and so forth. And typically the countries that have had the most intrusive kinds of, like, for example, banning encryption, which was the case in the past, or banning strong encryption, have typically been countries with the worst human rights records and so on. So it's clear that what modern society expects is the right to use encryption, and I don't think that's going to go away. And it brings with it also the right to use privacy tools like Tor, and to be able to spend money privately, because if you can only use free services and buy free content privately, that restricts your capabilities. So I think privacy for your sort of financial dealings and wealth storage, and so unseizability and other interesting properties about that. Very interesting too, which is where Bitcoin comes into the picture in finally addressing that big gap that was long recognized to exist in the privacy technology, which is, okay, we have ways to send PGP encrypted emails now, encrypted chat and voice communications, but no dependable way to have electronic cash at a distance, or to store value outside of government sort of controlled or regulated environments.
That brings us to a good question. How private is Bitcoin? Many people believe Bitcoin is not private. What updates are in the making?
Yeah, it turns out to be pretty hard to have both strongly private or fungible electronic cash. So you get fungibility as a side effect of some of the same privacy technologies. So while having a decentralized system, and decentralized systems, we see are important because the previous electronic cash systems, which were centralized, failed. And the cryptography for those centralized systems has extremely strong privacy, much stronger than Bitcoin or any privacy-focused altcoin. But they're centralized, and so once you make it decentralized, it becomes harder because there's no central server that can have a private key that you can assume is trusted or secure or not revealed. It turns out that's an unrealistic assumption anyway, but the decentralization also brings the benefit of full public auditability, which is a very new and powerful concept for electronic cash. But the cost of that is that you can't get that good privacy. So I think the privacy that we do have, there's some experimental things which are a bit high risk in terms of new cryptography. New cryptography needs peer review, and to survive, if it's very novel, more extensive peer review until we can get a view on whether it's dependable for the long term. So, but there is a known set of things which are believed to be pretty dependable, and Bitcoin uses those kinds of things, like elliptic curve cryptography and hashing, symmetric ciphers, things like that are all pretty well understood and dependable building blocks. But with those, Bitcoin's privacy has been improving over time. So the number of things, for example, typically incremental things that improve things a little bit, because there's no kind of silver bullet technology yet to do it fully. So the Schnorr signature topic, which is been a lot of discussion and review of the proposals this the last month or so. It doesn't provide that much privacy, but it does reduce fingerprinting. So fingerprinting, as in, if I'm using a particular type of wallet and it's always a multi-sig, or it's always this kind of multi-sig with a time lock on it, like Green Address has one of those, a Lightning channel looks a different way, then you can just do open source intelligence and parse the blockchain and figure out, okay, this user is a green user, this is a Lightning channel, and figure out which wallets they are. Maybe this is a coin join, which is not a good thing to be able to determine, but those are pretty obvious typically as well. And so Schnorr gives the prospect of, Schnorr and Taproot together particularly, give the prospect of harmonizing things. So basically, in the 99% case, all transactions look like just a single signature with no indication of what they're used for. The side benefit is that they are also smaller, because revealing more of the script takes up block space, basically. And the Schnorr and Taproot basically works, the way that Schnorr helps is that you can add together public keys with Schnorr in a way that you can't do with ECDSA. So you can have some types of multi-sig that look like a single sig. And then the Taproot is a way to have a sort of top-level if branch, where in the normal case you don't reveal a more complicated script, but if something goes wrong you do. So in the normal case then the rest of the script never becomes visible. So you would get fingerprinted if you have to use the escape clause, like, oh, the other guy's equipment died and I need to close a Lightning channel to get my money back. Then maybe I have to reveal a more complicated script, and it becomes obvious at that point, but only at that point in a rare situation. So that's the kind of benefit you get. But there are many other incremental privacy changes that have been made in Bitcoin over the years, and hopefully more to come as well.
Where do you see Bitcoin in 2020?
Well, it's an interesting year with a halving coming up in the early part of the year. So it remains to be seen whether the halving is priced in. I personally think not, because of volatility. So it's kind of typically hard economically to price in a future event, because you have to deal with the volatility risk in the interim, right? So you'd have to hedge that. And generally people who are looking for Bitcoin exposure are already exposed. They're already significantly invested. So for new money to try to benefit from a predicted price increase from the halving, supply reduction, they have to take Bitcoin price volatility risk for the next 5 months, which is maybe something volatile. It looks very scary in Bitcoin compared to conventional markets. So that's, if they think, oh, maybe I could make a pretty big return, but look at the volatility risk I have to absorb, then that would deter them. So, I mean, more technology things. There's lots of things going on, like L2 for Lightning improving, more Lightning wallets, the Schnorr signature benefits, and many things benefit from Schnorr. So you should see a number of wallets switching over to Schnorr, things with multi-sig switching to Schnorr, Lightning itself, Lightning L2 using Schnorr. So there are lots of opportunities for existing protocols to be incrementally improved by switching to Schnorr. Blockstream's Liquid network has a peg, so it's a sidechain to Bitcoin for exchange traders, and it has a peg where people move Bitcoin in and out of the sidechain, and that peg is managed by a big multisig, and that would also benefit from Schnorr, so we would look to move that across as well. One thing we probably will do at Blockstream is to try to integrate Schnorr signatures into the sidechain at a faster schedule than it will get into Bitcoin, because with Bitcoin there's more coordination needed for miners. So as soon as it looks stable, that there are no bugs or changes in the pipeline and relatively well tested, we're probably going to integrate it into a next version of Liquid so that people can try it out, and we can, everybody can get some sort of mileage on seeing if it works in practice. I think it's that's a useful factor for cryptography and complicated systems. It's kind of like a new airplane. You want to see it fly for a bit before you fly on it, kind of thing. Sometimes, or at least the test pilots to fly it. So I think mileage is good for that, even though it's extremely well reviewed. Plus, you also learn things by trying, basically, right? Until you do it in live with real money and build real systems with it, sometimes things don't become apparent. So there's benefits for that too. So, what else? Yeah, I mean, the other current topic that's warming up is confidential transactions in Bitcoin, potentially, and it's already in a number of things that have live value in them. So it's in Liquid itself. It was in Elements, which is an open source space for Liquid since June 2015. So it's been around for a while, and it's been live since earlier last year, so over a year now, and with real value, and people can install wallets and use it. It's been adopted or copied into a few altcoins, the Bytecoin, Monero, Kryptonite variants. At least Monero has, I'm not sure about the other ones. And confidential transactions is very related to Mimblewimble. So Mimblewimble uses the confidential transaction range proof. So several of the Mimblewimble coins have basically a part of confidential transactions being Grin and Beam. And more recently people are talking about trying to add Mimblewimble form of confidential transactions to Litecoin, and maybe other coins will try as well. So it's useful for people to see things used live and see them work in practice with real money at risk and do some applied R&D. I think the other big discussion point, I mean, there are a couple of factors that make CT an interesting conversation. It's a much more constructive conversation than a block size argument, because now it's a sort of privacy, confidentiality, fungibility argument. And it's a subtle one because it's really only talking about the confidentiality of the values. So if we engage in some transaction and I pay you some money, it's nobody else's business, generally speaking, how much the transaction was for, or what my wallet balance is or your wallet balance is before and after. And confidential transactions assures that, but it doesn't necessarily hide which addresses are paying which addresses, and people can still look at block explorers and so on. So it's a different form of privacy. It's, again, I'm not a silver bullet, but that makes it more incremental and easy to see that it's not a radical departure. But the couple of areas that are kind of topics for discussion typically are the size. They're bigger, I think maybe 10 times bigger. So in Liquid, the the big part, the range proof, is part of the witness data, so it has a lower weighting, but still it's 10 times bigger than a Bitcoin transaction in raw bytes. But I would argue it's a more powerful, useful transaction. So there are cases where people would use multiple regular transactions where a single TT transaction could replace them. For example, doing cold storage in smaller amounts so that you can peel them off and use them without revealing the storage amount, or for other, just basically for value privacy, to sort of simulate that with lots of small coins. And the other sort of topic that generates a lot of discussion about CT is the inflation risk, and there are a couple of versions of it. One which has more compactness options at smaller range proofs, that has inflation risk if quantum computers become practical, potentially very far into the future. And there is another variant which is not. So the variants which have that risk are the Pedersen commitment type and the bulletproof type. Bulletproofs being smaller than Pedersen. So if we say Pedersen are, let's say, 1800 bytes and bulletproof 600 bytes, then there's a inflation protected variant. It's called an El-Gamal commitment, which is 2400 bytes. So you can see it costs a bit more. And then there's another clever approach. So actually the El-Gamal version, the way that sort of the failure handling if quantum computing becomes real at scale decades into the future, there's no inflation risk, but privacy of the values is lost. So it kind of reverts to the current day. So you have to pay the cost, whatever it is, to decode one of these coins, and the reward, the benefit you get as the attacker is you see how much money was transferred, and that's it. Whereas with the inflation risk, you can take an existing coin and pretend it's worth more, so it's pretty destructive for Bitcoin. And the inflation risk version, obviously you would, in practice, work around and stop it. So there's another approach called switch commitments, which is you start with Pedersen and you switch to El-Gamal later, basically. And that gives you the space saving until it's relevant. So that's a more clever approach. So yeah, I mean, personally I'd be quite interested to see confidential transactions get into Bitcoin, but I think it's a debate for a few years down the road probably, because there may still be hope to have more compact and inflation protected ways to do this. And the state of the art in things like bulletproofs is improving quite quickly as well. Bulletproofs themselves are only a couple of years old, and there's a lot of applied and academic research driven by cryptocurrency use cases for these generic proofs of execution, which are very compact. So it's a very interesting development in general, for scalability also, and for smart contracts. So lots more things happening on a technical basis. In simplicity is another thing that we've been working on at Blockstream for a couple of years. It's a smart contracting language which is compact, a sort of extensibility mechanism for Bitcoin, and it has some formal proof concepts so that you can make formal proofs about the correctness as compared to constraints and sort of mathematical explanations of how you expect it to behave and so forth. So you can make some quite robust proofs about the behavior, about the maximum runtime, maximum memory, and that it won't overflow any bounds, and so forth.
Yeah, it seems like there's enough to work on. So overall, you're excited for next year.
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, actually, simplicity in particular, we made a developer release last month, and we're expecting to put that live into Liquid into next year, so that people can, again, start to get some experience and see what that can achieve. So as an example, if simplicity, I mean, simplicity was originally conceived in 2011, 2012, so it's pretty old and predates Blockstream. But active work on it didn't start until a few years ago when Blockstream recruited Russell O'Connor, who is a PhD language security researcher who had these ideas. And it relates to MAST, which more people have heard of. So it's a more sort of full generic story behind MAST. And so the idea was that it would be a script upgrade for Bitcoin with extensibility, but formal provable security behavior. And so, one interesting example is if Bitcoin, if a different path had happened, if this had happened much sooner, and Bitcoin had simplicity today, it would be possible to implement Schnorr signatures without a soft fork. Somebody could just develop the code and release it as a Schnorr contract and use it. And it's surprisingly compact. So even including a SHA-256 implementation and the Schnorr implementation, it would be in the 10, 15 kilobyte range, which is pretty surprising because that's many thousands of gates of logic. And in practice, you can also sort of make a macro out of it, like it's called a jet. So use an approach to make frequently used sort of functions repeatable without sending the function code on the chain again. So we'll add it to Liquid, and then people can see what they think about it, and maybe that will be of interest for Bitcoin itself also in a few years' time.
Okay, thank you so much for the insights.
Sure, thank you.
Great.